The heavy oak doors of the safe house didn't creak, they gave way with a low, expensive thud that echoed through the marble hallway. Kang Ji-hoon, the man whose name was a death sentence in the underworld of Seoul, moved with the jagged desperation of a man who had already lost his soul. His tie was loosened, his knuckles were split, and for the first time in 15 years, his hand trembled as he reached for the ivory handle of the nursery door. His security detail lay unconscious in the foyer, silenced not by bullets, but by something more precise. Something intimate. He pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the soft, rhythmic glow of a humidifying nightlight. The scent of lavender and expensive baby powder hit him, but beneath it was something else. A scent that shouldn't be here. A scent that had been scrubbed from his memory by 3 years of cold, hard whiskey and even colder vengeance. It was the smell of wild lilies. Ji-hoon stopped. His heart, a slab of ice he had cultivated since the day he threw her out into the monsoon, cracked. There, in the center of the dim room, sat a woman. She was perched in a velvet rocking chair, her back to the door, her silhouette cutting a sharp, dignified line against the shadows. The soft creak of the chair was the only sound in the room. "I told the guards to stay awake, Ji-hoon," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic rasp, a ghost's whisper that sent a surge of pure, unadulterated terror through his veins. "But I suppose you never did hire men who could resist a woman who knows exactly where their carotid arteries are." Ji-hoon's gun was out before he could think, the cold steel of the barrel leveled at the back of her head. "Get away from them," he hissed, his voice a serrated blade. "How are you alive, Ha-eun?" "I watched the car go over the bridge. I saw the wreckage." The rocking stopped. Slowly, she turned. Lee Ha-eun, the maid he had molded into a shadow, the woman he had accused of treason and discarded like a broken toy, looked at him. She wasn't the trembling girl he had exiled. Her face was a mask of marble, her eyes 2 pits of freezing ash. And then, his mind simply, cut. She wasn't holding a knife. She wasn't holding a detonator. She was nursing his son. The infant's tiny hand was curled against her chest, a small, rhythmic sound of contentment filling the silence that followed Ji-hoon's breath. In the crib beside her, his daughter stirred, her small fist grasping at the air as if reaching for the woman who shouldn't be there. "You spent your whole life serving me, Ha-eun," Ji-hoon whispered, his gun hand dropping an inch, his world tilting on its axis. "You wanted to be someone. You wanted the throne. Is this your revenge? To poison my blood with your touch?" Ha-eun looked down at the child, the heir to the Il-shin billion-dollar empire, and then back at the man who had destroyed her. She didn't flinch at the weapon. She didn't beg. "I'm not poisoning them, Ji-hoon," she said, a terrifying, beautiful smile touching her lips. "I'm making sure they survive you. Because the rival clans aren't at your gates anymore. They're already in this room. And I'm the only reason your legacy didn't stop breathing 10 minutes ago." She shifted the baby, her eyes locking onto his with a predatory intensity that made the mafia boss feel like a small, helpless boy. "The question isn't why I'm here, Ji-hoon," she whispered. "The question is, what are you willing to pay to make sure I don't stop?" The cold metallic click of the handgun echoed against the nursery walls, a sound that usually meant death was coming. Ji-hoon felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. His finger trembled on the trigger, but the woman in the rocking chair didn't even flinch. She kept her eyes on the baby, her face as calm as deep water, even though she was staring down the barrel of a mafia boss's weapon. "How are you breathing, Ha-eun?" Ji-hoon rasped, his voice thick with betrayal and confusion. "I saw the car. I saw the flames on that bridge 3 years ago. You were supposed to be a ghost." Ha-eun didn't look up immediately. She adjusted the soft blanket around the mafia heir, her movements filled with a motherly grace that felt like a slap to Ji-hoon's face. "The fire was hot, Ji-hoon, but your heart was colder," she whispered. Her voice wasn't weak anymore. It was sharp, like a hidden blade. I didn't just survive. I used every spark of that hate to rebuild myself. I thrived because I had to see the look on your face when I returned to take what matters most. Ji-hoon stepped closer, his boots heavy on the plush carpet. My guards, they are the best in the country. How did you get past them? A tiny, chilling smile touched her lips. I spent 15 years as your maid, remember? I cleaned the vents, I polished the safe, and I memorized the pulse of this house. Your elite team didn't just fail, I dismantled them one by one before they even knew a traitor was in the hallway. I didn't use bullets. I used the secrets you taught me. She finally looked him in the eye, and Ji-hoon felt a shiver of true fear. The girl who used to bow to him was gone. In her place was a woman who had walked through hell. I walked into this secret nursery because I wanted to prove a point, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. If I am close enough to feed your twins, Ji-hoon, I am close enough to end your entire bloodline. You think you are the hunter, but look at us. You are the one trapped in this room. Ji-hoon's hand shook as he realized the truth. He had spent years trying to forget the exiled maid, thinking she was a solved problem. Now, he was the one being held hostage in his own home. He looked at his son, then back at her dark, unforgiving eyes. The power had shifted. The man who ruled the city was now powerless in a room filled with baby powder and revenge. He realized that his life was no longer in his hands, it was in hers. The nursery felt smaller as the ghosts of the past crowded the room. Ji-hoon looked at Ha-eun's stony face and remembered the night he became her villain. It was raining 3 years ago when his men dragged her across the marble floor. He could still see the raw betrayal in her eyes as she reached for him, begging for a chance to explain. But Ji-hoon had been blinded by pride. Standing in the shadows was Secretary Kwon, leaning in with a cold whisper that changed everything. She sold your routes to the rivals, boss, Kwon had lied, showing fake photos of a secret alliance. Ji-hoon didn't investigate. He didn't ask questions. He simply gave the order for her brutal exile, throwing his most loyal servant into the mud like she was nothing. Back in the present, the silence was heavy. Ji-hoon reached for the radio on his belt, his thumb pressing the button to summon his mafia hitmen. He needed to reclaim his house and his pride. Security, come in. Code red in the nursery, he barked. But only static answered him. He tried again, his face turning pale. There was no signal. No backup was coming. Ha-eun let out a soft, mocking laugh that sent chills down his spine. Don't bother, Ji-hoon. I jammed your private frequency the moment I stepped onto the property. You taught me that a leader is only as strong as his communication. Right now, you are completely alone. Ji-hoon gripped his handgun, but he knew he couldn't fire. The twins were resting too close. He was a powerful boss who had lost all his leverage to a girl he once thought was disposable. Ha-eun stood up, gently placing the baby in the crib. She smoothed her apron, looking every bit like the worker she used to be, but with the eyes of an empress. You have 2 paths tonight, she said, her voice steady and cruel. Option 1, you let me stay as the shadow governess. I will raise your children and keep them safe from the enemies you are too slow to see. Option 2, you try to force me out. But if you do, I promise your heirs will never stop screaming. They won't eat from anyone else. They won't sleep for anyone else. She stepped toward him, ignoring the weapon in his hand. How will you explain that to your mafia board? How will the great Ji-hoon explain that he can't even control a maid in his own nursery? Your legacy is at stake. Choose wisely. Ji-hoon stood by the nursery window, watching the rain blur the city lights. He had no choice but to let the exiled maid stay, but he surrounded the room with his most loyal bodyguards. Even with cameras watching her every move, the power struggle had changed. Ha-eun didn't act like a prisoner. She moved through the halls with a quiet confidence that made the guards nervous. She started pointing out things Ji-hoon had missed, the blind spots in his high-tech security and even his illegal business deals. She spoke about his empire like it was a house of cards ready to fall. "You think you are safe behind these stone walls," Ha-eun said one afternoon, her voice cold and flat. "But a mafia boss is only safe if he knows who handles his bread." The tension snapped later that evening when a new shipment of expensive baby formula arrived at the secret nursery. The staff prepared to feed the twins, but Ha-eun suddenly stepped forward and knocked the bottle out of the nurse's hand. It shattered on the floor, the white liquid bubbling strangely against the rug. Ji-hoon lunged forward, his face red with anger, ready to punish her for the waste. "Look at the seal, Ji-hoon," she commanded, not backing down. When he looked closer, he saw a tiny, microscopic pinprick in the plastic. It was a poison shipment. His heart stopped. This formula came from his own private supply chain, the one he thought was the most secure part of his mafia empire. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Baekdu clan, his biggest rivals, hadn't broken into his house, they had simply bought the people he trusted to provide for his children. "They are using your own money to kill your heirs," Ha-eun whispered, her eyes filled with a dark pity. "While you were busy hating me, you let your enemies become your delivery men." Ji-hoon looked around his expensive mansion, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a castle. It felt like a trap. Every camera, every guard, and every locked door now felt like part of a deadly conspiracy. He had built a fragile fortress, but he had been the one to lock himself inside. He looked at Ha-eun, the woman he had treated like trash, and realized she was the only one in the room who wasn't trying to sell his soul. He began to wonder if his whole life was just a cage built by the very people who called him boss. Secretary Kwon stood in the dimly lit office, his face a pale mask of worry that didn't quite reach his eyes. He fidgeted with the gold cufflink on his sleeve, clearly shaken by the news that the exiled maid was back inside the house. To any outsider, he looked like a worried friend, but Ji-hoon was now looking at him through a different lens. The mafia boss sat behind his heavy desk, his mind replaying every warning Ha-eun had whispered in the nursery. "Boss, having her here is a security risk we cannot afford," Kwon said, his voice dropping into that familiar, oily tone of fake concern. "She is a traitor who knows too much. Let me handle it quietly. A secret execution tonight would solve everything. We can tell the staff she left on her own." Ji-hoon leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he watched his right-hand man. 3 years ago, he would have agreed without a second thought. But the poison shipment had changed everything. He realized he had been listening to Kwon's calculated whispers for far too long. "Maybe you're right, Kwon," Ji-hoon said slowly, testing the air. "But I was thinking about the old days. I was looking through the archives and noticed a missing ledger. It's the one from the month Ha-eun was sent away. Do you remember where you filed it?" For a split second, the mask slipped. Kwon's hand froze on his sleeve. There was a slight hesitation, a tiny flicker of panic in his pupils before he forced a smile. "The ledger? I'm sure it was lost in the office fire last year, boss. Why bring up such a small thing now?" That tiny pause was all the proof Ji-hoon needed. It was a loud scream in a quiet room. The missing ledger contained the real shipping routes and the proof of who had actually talked to the rival gangs. If it was gone, it was because someone had burned the evidence of their own betrayal. Ji-hoon felt a cold lump of rage form in his chest. He realized that the mafia empire he ruled was being steered by a snake hiding in plain sight. Ha-eun's theory was right. The girl he had kicked out into the rain was innocent, and the man he had trusted with his life was the real villain. Right. "The fire," Ji-hoon muttered, his voice cold as ice. "I forgot." Kwon nodded, looking relieved, but he didn't see Ji-hoon's hand tighten into a fist under the table. The loyal secretary was no longer a brother, he was a target. Ji-hoon realized he had been protecting a monster while hunting an angel. He needed to get back to the secret nursery, because the only person he could trust now was the woman who had every reason to want him dead. The dusty air of the old annex felt like a tomb. This was the small, cold building at the edge of the estate where Ha-eun had lived for 15 years. She had carried the twins here, away from the cameras of the main house, sitting on a wooden stool that creaked under her weight. When Ji-hoon stepped through the door, his expensive shoes looked out of place on the cracked floor. He saw the exiled maid holding his children in the same room where she used to sew his shirts and dream of a future he had stolen from her. "Why this place, Ha-eun?" Ji-hoon asked, his voice shaking with regret. "Because in your big house, everything is a lie," she said, her eyes red but dry. "Here, I remember who I am. I remember the girl you threw away." Ji-hoon stepped closer, wanting to touch her shoulder, but she pulled away. She stood up and turned her back to him, slowly pulling down the collar of her shirt. Ji-hoon gasped, his breath catching in his throat. Across her pale skin were jagged, ugly marks, physical scars that told a story of pain he never imagined. "The night you kicked me out, your men didn't just leave me at the station," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotionally raw pain. "They followed your silent orders. They tried to make sure I never spoke again. My brutal exile wasn't mercy, Ji-hoon. It was a death sentence." Ji-hoon felt sick. He had never given those orders, but his silence had allowed them to happen. "How did you survive?" "I went to the only people who hate you as much as I did," she said, turning back to face him. "The Baekdu rivals. But I didn't go to help them. I became their cleaner. I scrubbed their floors and emptied their trash, but I kept my ears open. I learned every secret alliance and every bribe they paid to your people. I worked in the shadows for 3 years, gathering enough dirt to bury them, and you, just so I could buy back my life." Ji-hoon looked at the Mafia heirs sleeping peacefully in the middle of this ruin. He realized that while he was sitting on his throne, Ha-eun had been crawling through hell to protect the very bloodline that had rejected her. He saw the strength in her tired eyes and felt a wave of shame. He had called himself a powerful boss, but he was nothing compared to the woman who had turned her scars into armor. For the first time, he didn't see a maid or a traitor, he saw a survivor who held the keys to his entire mafia empire. The revenge she wanted wasn't just blood, it was the truth, and it was finally setting his world on fire. The gates of the estate groaned open to welcome a black sedan from the Baekdu clan. They claimed they wanted a peace summit, but the air felt heavy with a deadly conspiracy. Ji-hoon sat at the long mahogany table, his hand resting near his hidden holster. Across from him sat an envoy with a cold, plastic smile and eyes that moved like a shark's. Ji-hoon's guard stood tall, but Ha-eun, dressed in her simple uniform, was the only one who truly saw the danger. As she moved forward to pour the tea, her eyes met the envoy's. She recognized him instantly. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was a high-level assassin she had seen in the darkest corners of the slums during her exile. He was a man who specialized in making mafia hits look like heart attacks. The envoy didn't recognize the Maid at first, looking at her with the same arrogance Ji-hoon once had. Ha-eun leaned in close, her hand steady as the hot liquid filled his cup. Just as the steam rose between them, she leaned toward his ear and whispered a secret code, a string of numbers and a name from a botched job in his past. The change was instant. The envoy's face turned from a pale white to a sickly gray. His hand began to shake, the porcelain cup rattling against the saucer with a sharp, rhythmic sound of pure terror. He looked at Ha-eun as if she were a ghost holding a scythe. He knew that if she spoke that code aloud, his own rival gang would hunt him down before he left the driveway. Ji-hoon watched the scene with wide eyes. His entire army of armed guards hadn't been able to make this man flinch, yet Ha-eun had paralyzed him with a single sentence. She moved back to the shadows of the room, her face as calm as a frozen lake. "The tea is quite hot today, isn't it?" she said, her voice sounding perfectly innocent to everyone but the man who was now too afraid to breathe. The peace summit ended abruptly. The envoy scrambled to leave, forgetting his briefcase and his pride. Ji-hoon stood up, looking at the woman who was supposed to be just a servant. He realized that while he had been buying bullets, Ha-eun had been collecting mafia secrets that were far more lethal. She had more leverage over his enemies than all his guns and money combined. The exiled maid wasn't just surviving in his house anymore, she was the one holding the shield over his entire mafia empire. For the first time, Ji-hoon felt like the student, and the maid was the master of the game. The cold wind whipped at Ji-hoon's face as he stood at the edge of the rusted bridge. Below, in the jagged ravine, lay the skeleton of a burnt-out car. This was the crime scene where his life had fractured 3 years ago. For a long time, he had believed the lie that Ha-eun had fled in a panic and crashed. But as he climbed down the rocky slope, his boots crunching on glass, the mafia boss saw something that turned his stomach. The brake lines hadn't snapped from the heat, they had been cut with a professional blade. This wasn't a mistake. It was a botched execution. Ji-hoon knelt by the driver's side, his fingers brushing against a small, magnetic box hidden behind the dashboard. It was a secret storage spot Ha-eun used when she was his maid, a place she thought only he would check if things went wrong. Inside was a tiny digital recorder, caked in dust but intact. With a trembling hand, he pressed play. Ji-hoon, if you are hearing this, it means you didn't believe me, her voice whispered through the static, sounding fragile and full of raw emotion. Secretary Kwon is moving the money. He's framing me because I saw him meeting with the rival gang. I'm not running away from you, Ji-hoon. I'm running because his men are behind me with guns. The recording continued, the sound of a roaring engine and screeching tires filling the air. Please, she sobbed, just once, look at the truth instead of your pride. I loved you more than my own life. Then, a loud crash, and silence. The Mafia Empire leader felt the world tilt. He had spent 3 years calling her a traitor, while she had died 1,000 deaths trying to save him. The calculated whispers of Secretary Kwon had been a poison he drank willingly. He realized that every night he spent in his warm bed, Ha-eun had been fighting for breath in the cold, all because he was too arrogant to trust his own heart. The weight of his guilt felt like a physical mountain pressing down on his chest. He clutched the recorder to his heart, let out a broken cry that was swallowed by the canyon. He had been a powerful boss of nothing. He had hunted an angel and protected a demon. He looked up at the mansion on the hill, his eyes burning with a new, terrifying light. The secret execution had failed, and now, Ji-hoon was going back to burn down every lie Kwon had ever told. The exiled maid deserved more than an apology, she deserved the heads of everyone who had turned her life into a grave of lies. The sirens hadn't even started before the first explosion rocked the foundation of the estate. The Baekdu clan had stopped playing games. Realizing their secret alliance with the traitor inside was falling apart, they launched a coordinated strike to wipe out the Kang bloodline forever. Bullets shattered the expensive glass of the foyer, and the smell of smoke began to fill the hallways. Ji-hoon didn't head for the vault, he ran straight for the secret nursery, his heart pounding with a fear no rival gang had ever caused him. Inside, the room was a whirlwind of motion. Ha-eun was already on her feet, her face tight with focus as she gathered the twins. There was no time for questions or regret. For the first time in years, the mafia boss and the exiled maid looked at each other and saw a partner instead of an enemy. The main exits are blocked. Ji-hoon shouted over the roar of gunfire. My men are falling. We're trapped. Not yet, Ha-eun replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. She pushed aside a heavy toy chest to reveal a small, disguised hatch in the floorboards. It was a secret escape tunnel she had spent months building back when she was just a servant, a hidden path she created because she knew the house's security had holes. This leads to the old well outside the perimeter. Take them and go. No, Ji-hoon said, grabbing her hand. The realization hit him with the force of a bullet. He had spent his life protecting a throne, but now he only cared about the woman holding the children. You take them. You're the only one they trust. I'll stay here and hold the line. Ha-eun paused, her eyes searching his. She saw the raw emotion and the truth he had finally accepted. He was no longer the arrogant leader, he was a man willing to face a deadly ambush just to buy her a few seconds of safety. Don't die, Ji-hoon, she whispered, a flicker of the old love returning to her gaze. As she disappeared into the dark tunnel with the Mafia heirs, Ji-hoon turned back toward the door. He leveled his weapon, his eyes cold and fixed on the hallway. He was a powerful boss standing in the ruins of his own home, but as the enemy moved in, he felt a strange peace. He was finally doing what he should have done 3 years ago, fighting for the woman he had once thrown away. This wasn't just a mafia war, it was his final chance at redemption, and he was ready to pay for it with his life. The smoke from the mafia war still hung heavy in the air when Ji-hoon kicked down the door of a private bank vault. His suit was torn and stained with blood, but his eyes were fixed on a small black book. This was the blood-stained ledger, the evidence that had been buried under a mountain of lies. As he flipped through the pages, the truth screamed at him. Secretary Kwon hadn't just made a mistake, he was a greedy mole who had been selling the syndicate's secrets to the rival gang for years. Every cent stolen from the company had been used to build Kwon's own private army. The images of Ha-eun's brutal exile flashed in his mind, and Ji-hoon realized he had destroyed his only light to protect a snake. He drove like a madman toward the old annex, his heart heavy with a crushing guilt. When he burst through the door, he didn't find a helpless victim. Ha-eun was standing in front of the twins' crib, her eyes blazing with a terrifying light. She held a jagged shard of glass in her hand, her knuckles white from the grip. She looked ready to take on an entire army to keep those children breathing. Even when she saw it was him, she didn't lower her weapon. She didn't trust the mafia boss anymore, and she had every right to hate him. Stay back, Ji-hoon, she hissed, her voice trembling with the weight of her raw emotion. I won't let anyone take them. Not the rivals, and not you. Ji-hoon didn't say a word. He didn't reach for his gun or use his power. Instead, the man who ruled the city's underworld simply let his knees hit the dusty floor. The powerful boss collapsed in front of the woman he had treated like trash, his head bowed in a silent plea for mercy. He held out the ledger, the proof of her innocence and his own stupidity. I found it, Ha-eun, he whispered, his voice breaking. I found the truth. I was the fool, and you were the hero. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire from the siege. He didn't ask her to forgive him, he knew he didn't deserve it. He just stayed there, a broken king in a ruined house, finally seeing the exiled Maid for who she truly was, the heartbeat of his empire. He had spent his life looking for a traitor, only to realize the only person he could trust was the one he had tried to destroy. Secretary Kwon was dragged into the dusty annex, his expensive silk shirt stained with sweat and the dirt of his failed mafia betrayal. His hands were tied, and the arrogant smirk he usually wore had been replaced by a pathetic, trembling sob. Ji-hoon stood behind him, his face like stone, holding a tablet that showed the faces of the syndicate board. The powerful elders of the underworld watched in silence through the video link, waiting for the blood to spill. Ji-hoon pulled his heavy handgun from his holster. Instead of aiming it at the traitor, he turned and offered the handle to Ha-eun. The room went cold. This isn't my decision, Ji-hoon said, his voice deep with raw emotion. You were the one he tried to kill. You were the one he sent into a brutal exile. His life belongs to you now. Kwon fell to his knees, crawling toward Ha-eun's feet. Please, Ha-eun. I was just doing what was best for the family. It was just business. He blubbered, the loyal secretary finally showing his true, cowardly colors. Ha-eun took the gun. The weight of the steel was heavy in her hand, a symbol of the deadly revenge she had dreamed of for 3 long years. She leveled the barrel at Kwon's forehead, her finger tightening on the trigger. The board members leaned in, expecting a mafia hit that would end the story. But then, Ha-eun's eyes flickered to the twins sleeping in the corner. She saw the peace on their faces and felt a different kind of power. Slowly, she lowered the weapon and handed it back to Ji-hoon. A gasp came from the tablet speakers. "Death is too easy for you, Kwon," she whispered, her voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. "If I kill you, you become a memory. But if I let you live, you become nothing." She looked at the camera, addressing the board. "I want his name erased from every book. I want his bank accounts emptied and his reputation burned. I want him cast out into the same gutters where he sent me, with nothing but the clothes on his back." Ji-hoon nodded, seeing the brilliance of her psychological execution. Taking his life was a crime, but taking his identity was a masterpiece. "You heard her," Ji-hoon barked at the screen. "He is no longer part of this mafia empire. Throw him into the streets of the slums. Let him see if he survives the world he created for her." As the guards dragged a screaming Kwon away, Ha-eun stood tall, her head held high. She had won without becoming a monster. The exiled maid had finally delivered a judgment that was far more painful than a bullet. She had turned the villain into a ghost, proving that her mercy was the most terrifying weapon of all. The grand ballroom was filled with the most dangerous men in the country. The heads of the 5 families sat in heavy leather chairs, their faces tight with suspicion. Everyone expected a declaration of war or a bloody mafia hit to follow the recent chaos. They thought Ji-hoon had grown weak and was ready to step down. But when the mafia boss walked to the center of the room, he wasn't alone. Ha-eun walked beside him, her head held high, wearing a dress the color of midnight. She didn't look like an exiled maid anymore, she looked like a queen returning to her throne. Ji-hoon placed a thick stack of documents on the table. 3 years ago, I made a mistake that nearly destroyed this mafia empire, he began, his voice echoing with raw emotion. A murmur went through the crowd. It was unheard of for a leader to admit a failure in public. "I believed a lie and threw away the most loyal person I have ever known. I called her a traitor, but she was the only one who actually saved my children." He picked up a tattered, blood-stained envelope. "These are the partnership papers I signed 3 years ago, before the lies took over. I intended to make Ha-eun my partner back then. Today, I am finally finishing what I started." The leaders of the rival gangs leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. Ji-hoon looked at Ha-eun, and for the first time in front of his peers, his cold mask melted into something human. The Il Shin syndicate will no longer have a single ruler. From this moment on, there are 2. Every decision I make must pass through her. Every dollar we earn belongs to her. He took Ha-eun's hand, his grip firm and protective. "This is not just a political merger to strengthen our bloodline. This is a marriage built on the truth. I am asking the woman I wronged to help me lead a new world." The grand settlement was a shock to the underworld. Ji-hoon wasn't just giving her a title, he was giving her half of his soul and all of his power. He was offering a personal redemption that proved his love was stronger than his pride. The room was silent as the other bosses realized the game had changed. They weren't just dealing with a ruthless man anymore, they were facing a united front. The exiled maid had finally found her place at the head of the table, and the mafia boss was finally man enough to stand by her side. This wasn't just a deal, it was the birth of a new mafia dynasty. The morning of the grand wedding arrived with a golden sun that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past. The estate was locked down in a high-security net, but for the first time, the guards weren't there to keep people out, they were there to honor a new era. In the center of the garden, surrounded by the most powerful leaders of the mafia world, Ji-hoon stood waiting. When Ha-eun appeared, she didn't look like the girl who once scrubbed floors. She walked with the fire of a survivor and the grace of an empress. As they stood before the altar, Ji-hoon reached into his pocket. He didn't just pull out a diamond ring, he held a heavy, gold ring engraved with the seal of the syndicate. This was the key to the vaults, the codes to the ships, and the final word on every mafia hit in the country. He slid it onto her finger, his eyes wet with raw emotion. "With this, I grant you co-sovereignty," Ji-hoon declared, his voice booming so every rival gang leader could hear. You are no longer my shadow. You are my equal. Your word is my law, and your life is my life. The crowd went silent as they realized the magnitude of the grand settlement. Ha-eun had become the most powerful woman in the underworld, moving from a brutal exile to the highest throne in the land. She looked at Ji-hoon, seeing the man who had finally broken his pride to find his heart. A few weeks later, the atmosphere in the main boardroom had completely changed. The long mahogany table, once a place of fear and deadly conspiracy, now felt different. Ha-eun sat at the very head of the table, her signature on the latest Mafia Empire contracts. In the corner of the room, a colorful playpen had been set up. The Mafia heirs giggled and played with their toys, their happy sounds filling the space where men used to whisper about death. Ji-hoon stood directly behind her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He watched as she outmaneuvered a group of greedy investors with a single, sharp look. He didn't feel weak for sharing his power, he felt invincible. He looked at the exiled maid who had saved his soul, and then at the children who would grow up in a world built on truth instead of lies. The mafia boss finally understood that his guns and his millions were nothing but cold metal and paper. His greatest power was the woman he had almost lost to the rain. As Ha-eun closed the folder and smiled up at him, the story of the secret nursery was over. A new legend was beginning, the legend of the Empress and the man who was lucky enough to be her king.